Becky Roberts will be your presenter today. Lynn Markham will be assisting her. Becky and Lynn are both land use specialists, and Becky is the interim director of CLUE. Becky, you may begin the webinar.
All right, thank you, Morgan, and thank you all for joining us today. So on the docket today, we're going to be talking about comprehensive planning. For those of you who are new to this topic, I will be going through a few fundamentals. After that, we'll be moving into some community examples. There's not one right or correct way to do comprehensive planning. It can actually be a very creative process that's tailored to meet the needs of your community. So I do want to share some examples and specifically also talk about some different approaches to future land use mapping. And then we'll wrap up with some data and mapping resources and also touch just a bit on some potential funding opportunities. So while you were waiting to join, we had launched a planning poll and we had two questions in that poll. One was, what is your experience with community planning? And the second question was, when was your plan last adopted or updated? So I'm going to share the results of that poll. All right, so you should be seeing that in front of you. It looks like about a third of you, this is your first experience with planning. And then a little over half of you say that you're familiar with your community's comprehensive plan. A number of you are using the plan regularly for decision making, and at least a good handful have helped develop the plan for your community. Okay, then we also have a range of responses in terms of when was your plan last adopted or updated. So 40% within the last 5 years, so fairly recent comprehensive plans. 35% within the last 10 years, 15% more than 10 years ago, and a handful of you are also not quite sure. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing those results. If you still see the results in front of you, you may need to X out of that poll. Okay, so let's start with some of the basics here. So why do we do planning? Planning really allows a community to reflect on where they have been and where they want to go. It allows the community to anticipate, balance, and decide how to meet their needs. And so the needs of each community are all unique. Okay, so this for your community, this could mean protection of community resources and character. For some communities, maybe we're thinking more about economic development or how we're investing our public funding and buildings and infrastructure. It could be about cost-effective delivery of services, or perhaps even how are we interacting with our neighboring communities to think about land uses that respect each other, as well as additional intergovernmental cooperation ideas. In most cases, communities are also thinking about balancing community interests along with private rights. Okay, so there can be a variety of purposes for planning. Okay, there can also be a variety of different types of plans. Planning documents can vary in purpose, content, time horizon, geography, and legal status. I've listed just a few different examples here. So we may have regional plans, comprehensive plans, sub-area plans, site plans. We can also be much more strategic, thinking about, what is the vision for our community? What are our priorities? We could be thinking about funding in the sense of a capital improvement plan. So how does a comprehensive plan fit within this? First, let's think about geography. Okay, so I've circled here the municipal level. That's a common level for plans to be developed. Okay, you could also have some sub-area plans and you could have regional plans. When we think about comprehensive planning, we're typically thinking at the local government level. So typically a town, city, village, or perhaps even a county might be developing a comprehensive plan. And then we also have some regional planning commissions in the state who develop comprehensive plans as well. Those are typically a bit more advisory in nature. Okay. Then let's also think about the focus or the content of the plan. Okay, we can have different functional type plans. Maybe we're thinking about greenways or environmental corridors. Maybe we're thinking about targeted housing development or economic development. Okay, transportation. Those are all examples of different topics or a focus for a planning document. Okay? When we think about a comprehensive plan, we're really thinking holistically about how these types of topics and more fit together within your community. And lastly, we can be thinking about time horizon. Okay, so this particular example here happens to show a transportation plan and how a series of different plans might nest within each other. So here, maybe a metropolitan planning organization prepares a long-range transportation plan designed to identify regional policies and goals 20 years in the future. Okay, nested within that, we may have a 10-year queue of projects that we're considering at the state level. And then we may also have a very short-term list of projects where you're providing very detailed project details. You can think of comprehensive planning along the same lines, okay? A comprehensive plan is typically looking out 10 to 20 years into the future. We may have additional plans nested within that are thinking on a more near-term basis. So as we talk about comprehensive plans, let's look to state statutes to see what is required. Okay, so if you're interested in looking this up, and if you're contemplating a comprehensive plan update process, I would suggest reading the actual statutory language and refreshing your knowledge of that. I need to do that every so often as well. Okay, so the comprehensive plan is described as a guide to the physical, social, and economic development of a community. It provides guidance over a 20-year period. However, the plan itself must be updated at least once every 10 years. So plans will typically include a series of goals, objectives, policies, data, and maps, as well as programs and actions to implement the plan. The plan itself is not self-implementing. So you need to describe what actions you're going to take after you've created this plan, what implementation tools you might utilize to actually put the plan into action. So there's also different required elements of a comprehensive plan. You could think of this almost like chapters to a plan, and that's one way that many communities will organize their plan. Okay, so you can see things like issues and opportunities. So where have we been as a community? What does our data say? Where are we headed? And then there's some of these topical elements, things like housing, transportation, agriculture, natural resources, economic development, and so forth. As communities are developing plans and they're trying to tailor them to fit their needs, many communities are doing some unique things with these elements. So they may be adding elements. The image I have shown here would be a health element. Maybe communities are focusing on aging or sustainability or broadband, whatever it is that is kind of the topic du jour and what's important in their community. You have the ability to go above and beyond what's strictly required within these 9 different elements. So some communities are adding elements. Others are reframing or renaming these elements. So maybe we're thinking about housing and neighborhood character. And so oftentimes communities are kind of adding on to some of these different elements and describing them in ways that are more appropriate for their community. Okay. And then sometimes people are also thinking about how can we have some overarching themes that might run through our community, sustainability, energy, what have you. Okay. So the comprehensive plan, or at least the comprehensive planning law, provides a structure for the plan in terms of content, but it also provides a process, okay? And so what you see down here is the minimum required process for updating or adopting a comprehensive plan. Okay, so these bullet points are important, but this is just a starting point. Communities oftentimes go above and beyond this. Okay, so what are the minimums? Okay, we need to have written public participation procedures. We need to distribute the plan for review and comment. At a minimum, hold a class 1 notice 30 days prior to a public hearing. Okay, the Plan Commission recommends the plan by resolution. The governing body adopts the plan by ordinance. There's a variety of different places we need to file and make the plan available. And then lastly, we need to update the plan at least once every 10 years. Okay. So I will come back to the idea of process because the process can be much more rich than this. As part of these legal requirements, there's also what's known as a consistency requirement. Okay, so the way this is currently written is that new or amended zoning, land division, and official mapping ordinances must be consistent with an adopted comprehensive plan. Okay, and this was added as a way to give a little bit of legal teeth to the plan. Okay, so since the planning law was first adopted, we've also added a definition for consistent. So consistent means furthers or does not contradict the objectives, goals, and policies contained in the plan. This doesn't mean that your zoning ordinance needs to look exactly like your comprehensive plan, nor does your zoning map need to look exactly like your future land use map. There's going to be differences between the two. The plan is generally going to be more future oriented, more visionary, more broad, but it sets the future vision for what it is that you're trying to accomplish through some of these implementation tools like zoning and subdivision regulations. So we'll unpack that just a little bit later. All right, so I like to think of it like this. This comprehensive plan is this guiding document, okay? There are a variety of tools to implement the comprehensive plan. The three I've shown here happen to be regulatory tools, and they happen to be the three that need to be consistent with the plan. But having said that, I don't want you to forget that there's a whole range of other tools, okay? Not only regulatory tools, but there's also intergovernmental cooperation tools. There's a variety of different investment tools, financial or incentive-based tools. We can have detailed plans that are helping to implement our plan, our comprehensive plan, and we can also have design-based tools. Okay, so these are just a few of the tools that we might be recommending within our plan, and you may have others within your community. All right, so this would be a really great place to pop up our next poll. Okay, so we have two questions in this poll. First is, which of the following topics is most important to your community? I've placed this here, and I only want you to select two tools because I know communities have limited capacity for planning. And so I want you to think, if you had limited resources and could only update two topics, which of those two topics that I've listed here might you consider updating? Okay. And then the second question is, how is your community using the comprehensive plan? And you can select all that apply here. Feel free to answer the poll question. And if you have some additional responses that don't necessarily fit well with the answers I've given you, feel free to type them in the chat box. I'll give you a few minutes. And as you're doing that, I'm also going to display this comprehensive plan status map. Okay. So in 2023, the Wisconsin Department of Administration collected on a statewide basis. Basically, they polled communities and they said, who has comprehensive plans? When were those plans last updated? And then they also looked at some of those tools that needed to be consistent. So specifically zoning and subdivision regulations. Okay, and then they created a series of maps showing who has current plans, meaning they were adopted within the last 10 years, who has a bit of an older plan that was adopted more than 10 years ago. Those would be the ones shown in dark gray here. And then who does not have an adopted comprehensive plan? Those would be those shown in the lightest gray here. So on the left status map, you can see at the county level who has current plans in blue, who has slightly older plans, and who never adopted a plan. Now, I know this is just a snapshot in time. I know there's certain communities like Vernon County that have since adopted plans, and many of these others probably have as well. In contrast, the map that you see on the right shows the status of towns, cities, and villages. So it's the same color scheme. What we're generally seeing is that cities tend to stay most on top of having current comprehensive plans. Villages are a little bit slower, as are towns. So only about a third of towns and villages have those current plans. All right, well, Lynn, this would be a great place if you don't mind sharing the results, and I'll let you describe what you're seeing as well.
Sure. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay. So the most common topic that was important to the community was land use at about 2/3 of the responses. Second was housing at around half. And third was economic development at also around half. So those were the most common responses to the first question. There was also a comment saying that they would add affordability to this question. I assume they mean affordable housing, most likely. For the second question, how is your community using the comp plan? The leading two were consulting it when making development decisions and informing zoning decisions. There were also some communities using it for budgeting or cap planning. Some folks who said they don't really use the plan. So that's what we saw there.
All right, well, thank you. And I'll tell you, those results are not too surprising. I would say the land use element is probably the one I hear most frequently as the most important element of a comprehensive plan when I do little polls like this. And then increasingly, housing has been a big issue in many people's mind. So as I wrap up some of these fundamentals of planning before I move into some of the planning examples, I want to point you to one of our primary resources for comprehensive planning in the state. So the Wisconsin Department of Administration is a great repository for a number of those resources. First, they have a library of adopted comprehensive plans, and this is growing. So one of the places that you're required to submit your updated plans would be to the Department of Administration. And so as a result, we have this nice little Excel spreadsheet that shows who has plans, when they were last updated. So I find that to be a really great resource. If you're looking for examples of planning documents, if you're looking to check in on perhaps how did a consultant work with XYZ community, or what might a regional planning commission look like, or what did my neighbors do? This is a really great space to find some of those examples of planning documents. Okay. They also have a list to element guides. They've described legal and procedural requirements, and they also have links to a variety of data mapping and agency resources. So I recommend taking a peek at this website. So I've talked about the legal and procedural requirements for comprehensive plans from a state statute perspective. But now I want to take a closer look at some actual community examples, looking first at process and content, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into approaches to future land use mapping, and to some extent, how communities might be working with their neighbors. Okay. So process, I led early on that there's that required adoption process, but the process of developing a plan can be really quite rich. Okay, and this is something that needs to be tailored to your community. And it's going to vary depending on if you want to take an incremental approach to planning, where perhaps you update one element at a time, or if you want to take kind of a one and done approach, where you would update the entire comprehensive plan all at once. Communities typically on that schedule will do it about once every 10 years. Okay, so some common elements in planning, I've listed them down here, would be establishing a fact base. So it's about looking at existing data, looking at existing maps, looking at development constraints, natural resources, and so forth to say, where are we now? Okay. Then oftentimes communities will be thinking about developing a vision for the future. Okay. That's oftentimes further explained through goals, objectives, and policies that will guide future decisions. And then a community is identifying actions to carry out their plan. So another way to think about it is analyzing, envisioning, planning, and then evaluating. I've shown it here as a circular process because for most communities, planning is not done. We're also thinking about monitoring and assessment. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get to plan implementation. So I can't go into every detail of plan process design or public participation, but one very good resource that's out there is our Plan Commission Handbook. There's a chapter on each of these topics. And within each of those chapters, there's also a variety of sample worksheets that can help you think through on a very detailed basis what this might look like for your community. So it might mean thinking about what is your current capacity, how might we design the planning process or the public participation process. It can prompt you to think about who are the different stakeholders in a community, what might be some barriers to participation, how do we craft communication strategies, and so forth. So take a peek at that if you're in an active process to design a planning process or update your plan. Again, on public participation, we could do entire workshops on this. So I'm just going to touch on it here and just remind you of the obligation to involve your community within planning, to use a variety of techniques, and to seek diverse participation. It's so from a minimum process standpoint, there's a specific role for the Plan Commission as well as for your elected governing body. But it's more than just those elected and appointed officials sitting in a room. It's really about going out and speaking to your community and hearing what it is that people envision for their community, how they might like to see you approach planning within your community. Okay, so you need to engage the public early on in the process, as well as after the plan has been adopted. And the Plan Commission is in a great role to be able to provide that type of public engagement. So many communities often start with a visioning process. The funny thing here is that the word vision is not actually included in state statutes, but yet that's a tool or a technique that communities often utilize when they're thinking about their plan. Okay, so really this is thinking about what is it that we value about our community? What is it that we want to preserve? What is it that we want to achieve in the future? So this little graphic here was something I had used with Vernon County recently as they were creating their comprehensive plan. They were creating the vision for the first time. So you can see here, this actually isn't the vision that was included in the plan. This is one that had been utilized by some of their economic development stakeholders. So you can utilize those types of things to inform and to use as a starting point for your discussions. Other communities will start with various exercises, kind of thinking about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats within their community. And they do this in a very intentional format to kind of dive in. What is it in our community that we love? What are some of the potential issues that we need to address, and so forth. Other communities will start with scenario-based planning, where they're thinking about, here's where we currently are under these different scenarios, maybe different growth scenarios. What might we like to be, and how might we do that? Okay, so this is an example from Madison, developed by the Capital Area Regional Planning Commission, where they looked at some different scenarios and they used survey data to kind of poll people and figure out what vision reflected where they wanted to go in their community. Typically, then, once you start creating content for your plan, many communities are stating those as a series of goals, objectives, and policies. So kind of nested underneath a vision might be a goal. You can have some pretty broad goals, oftentimes topical based. Here's an example about conserving, protecting, and improving agricultural, natural, and cultural resources in the village and surrounding area. And then they have some specific specific objectives, such as protecting environmentally sensitive areas, such as floodplains, drainage ways, wetlands, and so forth. And then they move on into more specific policies, such as utilizing zoning or shoreline wetland ordinances to protect these areas. And after we've gone through goals, objectives, and policies, communities often rank those and they prioritize those, and they say, we could do 100 things, but where are we going to devote our time? So this is an example. This happens to be from the city of Bayfield. These are priorities for the Plan Commission. So it's really about identifying who's responsible for these actions. In this case, they've also identified some additional committees they need to work with. And then they've ranked these from high priority to somewhat lower priority. And you can see some of the different topics and things that they're looking to work on, such as a housing study, creating a task force to look at green infrastructure, creating a signed ordinance, a parking study, and so forth. Here's one more example. This is from the Village of Prairie du Sac, where they've identified their top 3 priority plan implementation initiatives. And then they also have some additional supporting priority actions as well. Another technique that I've been seeing in more and more plans and that I really like is you can produce a lot of content for comprehensive plans. And so some communities are challenging themselves to create a more graphic, kind of high-level summary of what they are looking to accomplish related to different topics. So in this case, I believe this is Burlington, Iowa, rather than Burlington, Wisconsin. But as a summary of their housing chapter, they place their primary goals and objectives along with their prioritized housing actions, together with some images that are trying to inspire what it is they're trying to achieve, along with the description of current and existing conditions. All right, so we're going to pause here. We're going to have another set of planning poll questions. 2 questions here. which of the following updates would you find to be most helpful? This is answering for your community. You can select all that apply here. And then secondarily, what are the largest barriers to updating your plan? And I want you to pick just one here so we can kind of see which of those rise to the top. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Again, answer the poll question, and then you can type additional answers in the chat box. As you're doing that, I want to just reflect on defining scope. Okay, so you're all at various points in the planning process. Some of you have current plans and might be thinking about how do we go back and check for implementation. Others maybe have very dated plans and you're saying we need a total refresh, or maybe we have limited capacity. So we're going to focus on those one or two topics that are most important to us, such as land use or housing. So what I would encourage you to do is, if you are in that plan update stage, think about kind of these basic questions: the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And this can really help you set the scope of what a potential plan update might look like, or in terms of where you focus on evaluating your current efforts. All right, Lynn, if you could go ahead and show the poll results and describe them, I would appreciate it.
Sure. So the first question, which of the following updates would be most helpful? The ones that came out near the top were revisit vision, goals, objectives, and policies, update the future land use map, and address new or emerging issues. Implementation checklists, census data, and updating graphics were a little bit lower on that. Then the second question, what are the largest barriers to updating your plan? It was pretty much a tie here between money, staff, and then a little bit lower was time. But money and staff definitely came out on top.
All right, well, thank you. And so some of the remaining topics are going to touch on a few of these things. So I think we forgot to share those results, but they are now popping up on your screen. Once you're done viewing those, you can again X out of those poll results. All right, so I want to dive into some additional detail with some community examples, thinking more specifically about the future land use map. I do spend a lot of time talking about this simply because most communities express that this is one of the most important components of their plan. Okay, part of some of these examples also help us think about how might you work, let's say you're a town, and perhaps you're even under county zoning, how might you work with your county cooperatively, or if you are a town or municipality, how might you also engage with your neighbors so you can kind of compare land uses and so forth. Okay, so there's many ways to map the future. If you again look through all those different element requirements, almost every single one of them has some sort of mapping requirement. Oftentimes those are baseline maps, but then as we're moving into the future land use map, we may be starting to incorporate things like development concepts, future land uses. We may also go above and beyond and have some different growth illustrations or some details for specific areas where we know that we're going to be growing. So think about if you need to update your future land use map, these are maybe some questions you could ask. What type of map do you want? Where are you focusing? What decisions specifically are we looking to guide? Certainly land use, but there's some other aspects here. What future land use categories do we want to use? And who actually decides what goes where? Okay, is this your appointed and elected officials? Are you involving community members? Is this very much consultant or expert-based advice? There's a variety of different ways you can think about this. So let's dig into some of these examples. All right, the first example I want to include here is actually a multi-jurisdictional plan. This is for Douglas County and all 16 towns that are located within the county. This happened to be prepared by the Regional Planning Commission. So this is Northwest Wisconsin. In all of these examples, I start with a little cover sheet like this, and I've included a link to their plan as well. So these slides will be available after the webinar, and you're welcome to look up some of these examples if you're interested. Okay, so one of the unique things that Douglas County did as they were developing their future land use map, I would say this is a precursor. to their map is they actually looked at potential development constraints. Okay, and you can see those areas in black and those criteria that they identified. These are potential limits on development. So when I think about a constraint, this might be a physical limitation, an environmental limitation, infrastructure, or potentially even policy constraints. So things like setbacks from shorelands would be an example of that. Okay, so you can see quite a large area of their community was included in these black areas. These white straight lines happen to be the town boundaries within the county. When it came time to develop their future land use map, the Regional Planning Commission staff actually recommended some standardized future land use categories. So you can see the examples that they started with, and then they actually allowed towns where necessary to modify some of these land uses. The end result, you can see these are some selected town examples of their future land use maps. Even though they started with these same future land use categories, there were actually some variations when it came time for each of the towns to map their future land use categories. And so there's pros and cons to that. On the one hand, from a staff administration perspective, from a planning perspective, it's much easier to have uniform categories and to look at that countywide and to see where people compare at the individual boundaries of different towns. But at the same time, there's also a political reality here. And so I think in this situation, they began with where the towns are at. The towns really felt like they needed a say in the process. And so by being able to modify what categories they were using, they felt like they were better reflecting their desires. Along with those future land use categories, at least those categories where residential use was allowed, they also included some preferred density. So they expressed this in terms of maximum recommended dwelling units per acre. And so you can see a range away from 1 dwelling unit per 10 acres, which is associated with the rural traditional area, to single family residential, which would have one dwelling unit per 1 acre. One thing that this committee also did is they thought about in advance potential land use conflicts. Okay, and they talked about how they could potentially address this through zoning district categories, either through buffering, through size limitations, etc. And they also thought about interjurisdictional conflicts. And they started to address that at least on a high level in terms of if we're thinking about extraterritorial plat review, if we're thinking about development density and how the maps of one community compare to the maps of the next, we're thinking about annexation, extension of municipal services, how do we rectify some of those potential conflicts? So again, just a few things I want to highlight here that will be in contrast to some of the other examples I have for you here. This was a countywide effort led by the RPC. They did utilize consistent land use categories, but then allowed towns to develop their own maps with potentially some modified categories. In the end, this ended up being a patchwork quilt of town maps. Okay, the way they addressed some of those potential conflicts was through that identification of land use conflicts and potential interjurisdictional conflicts. So some pros and cons there. Let me go through a couple more examples, then we can come back and reflect on some of these issues. Let me also bring you to, this is an example where a town and a city had initially created a plan together. So this is the town and city of Sparta, which is down kind of southwest Wisconsin. So we started off with this joint plan. This happens to be a screenshot from 2003. And then afterwards, the town and city decided to create their own plans. In the case of the town plan was highly simplified the second time around. One thing that they did is they pulled out one chapter for future land use. They also had a chapter for plan implementation. And then they kind of grouped all their goals, objectives, and policies together. One thing that you will also find is that they pulled out all their data and they put that in an appendix. That's oftentimes a really smart way that if you anticipate you're going to be updating your data on a time frame that's a little bit different than updating the rest of the plan, that's a good approach. It's easier to do. So let me share the future land use map from the town of Sparta, which is on the left, versus the city of Sparta. And this is really unique. I don't think I've seen very many examples of this throughout the state. But what you'll see is they actually utilize, if you see these 4 different land use categories, those are reflected identically in the city. So rural lands, rural residential, rural commercial, and public and institutional. Okay, so what happened here is they actually utilized the same consultant for mapping and preparation of the plan, but they each did their own thing. There were a number of benefits here, especially as we think about, you can see this boundary here. This is the extraterritorial jurisdiction of the city. We can see that reflected within the town area here. So they're definitely thinking about how do we plan for the future? How do we plan as the city grows? How do we prevent potential land use conflicts? The other thing, this happens to be a matrix that comes from the city plan. In addition to that future land use map, they've gone and they've translated those future land use categories into potential zoning districts. So what we see here on the left, we have different land use categories ranging from, I've only shown residential related ones, so ranging from rural lands all the way down to high density residential. Then they've described preferred density. So in this rural lands category, 1 unit per 20 acres. And they said this is appropriate with the following zoning designations within the city, extraterritorial jurisdiction, and broadly within the town. And you can see how that varied for other land use categories on their maps. Okay, they actually said some of these uses, such as high density residential, are really only meant for the city. Okay? It's not really meant for the towns or the extraterritorial area. Okay, so you can see how there's different density ranges, and then also translating it. How does that future land use map potentially translate to zoning district categories? Right, so just summarizing the approach in this situation, the town and city develop plans separately, but with the same consultant and with the same future land use map categories. The town in this situation simply selected fewer categories. So a big deciding factor for the town was this natural resource protection overlay. They had some rural residential and commercial in pretty close proximity to the city. And then everything else was identified as rural lands. Okay? That matrix that I showed then helped translate for both the city and the town their mapping categories in the plan to potential zoning districts and suitable density standards. Let me turn now to a plan that's from the town of Ironton in Sauk County. This is probably the smallest example that we're going to show you. This happens to be an agricultural community west of Reedsburg, so again, more southwest Wisconsin. So they began with a community survey. It's a fun, interesting little one to take a peek at if you're interested in that. And then their approach to future land use was actually quite simplified. You can see these green areas across their map. These are farmland preservation areas. That was a defining factor within their community. And then these yellow areas, you can see this is around the village of Ironton and Lime Ridge. They had future development transition areas. What's really unique about this plan, though, is that they went above and beyond the future land use map, and they had different graphic depictions, almost like a pictorial guide of what should be happening within those transition areas. So here is a preferred depiction where immediately next to villages, which can potentially grow, they're talking about more dense development, more traditional small lot subdivision type patterns, rather than less desirable would be kind of this non-contiguous road outward. Okay. So the primary tools that they're going to be utilizing to implement this would be their county zoning ordinance, farmland preservation ordinance, and subdivision ordinance. And here's just some additional pictorial guides about siting residential or other types of development within some of their agricultural and woodland areas. Okay. So for a town, it's actually quite appropriate to have very few land use categories. Okay, in this case, they talk about farmland and they talked about those transition areas, and they had a variety of state lands as well. And then what I liked about this particular example is that they're using those additional texts and images to guide how that future development is going to occur. Let's now go to a village example. This happens to be from Mount Horeb in Dane County, kind of south central Wisconsin, just outside of Madison. Okay. This is probably one of the most graphic plans, and I really got a good sense of the spirit of Mount Horeb from this one. They front and center, they talked about what their vision was. They talked about their overarching plan goals. Many of these relate specifically to some of their different topics or elements. And they also do something pretty unique on their future land use map. Okay, so this is the municipal boundaries, kind of within the center here. And these are some surrounding town areas. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on a couple of these text annotations. So this is an area outside of the exact municipal boundary of the village, but it's an area where they anticipate they're going to grow. And they've actually included additional guidance directly on the map. So essentially, the plan specifies conditions under which growth may occur. So in this situation, they said development of this area is conditioned on the improvement of a new north-south of Electra Road. They also provided some guidance in terms of land use. So they thought of this as a planned neighborhood, which could include a mix of different uses. So you can see, let's say you're trying to use this to inform zoning decisions. You might think about first, is the use proposed appropriate and which districts might it go into? But then you're also going to think about this development constraint. So is that collector road present? If not, is it planned for within a capital improvement plan or a road plan? Okay? And if not, maybe at this point in time, development is not appropriate. The rezone may not be appropriate quite yet until that infrastructure is in place. And then flipping to the northeast side of their community, they have the same type of guidance. This one happened to relate to utility capacity. So in this space, they talked about development being constrained by utility capacity. So they set a gross density limited to just over 2 dwelling units per acre, unless you can arrange for alternative utility. And then very much like a couple of these last examples, they had this table that helped translate their future land use categories into appropriate zoning districts. I've been seeing this technique in more and more plans. It can be quite helpful. Right. So what was unique about this situation is that they listed those development constraints directly on the future land use map. Oftentimes communities will have these future land use maps and people think, oh, this is planned for future residential, but they don't necessarily think about the underlying conditions that need to be present, either in terms of infrastructure or overcoming other natural resource development constraints, or what the appropriate timing or density is. So the more of those factors that you can relay either on your map or in supporting resources like a table or a text description, that's going to be quite helpful. Okay. And then the very last example I'm going to provide you here is actually from the town of Sebastopol, which is located in Door County. And they took a very different approach to their plan. They created a very graphic plan as well as an interactive story map. And so this may be appropriate for some communities who want more of an action-oriented plan or who want something that's more tailored to perhaps residents utilizing or developers utilizing. So let's kind of dive in to see what we have here. So similar to that Burlington example that I gave you earlier, they created these summaries for various elements of their plan. This one happens to relate to housing. So they included a housing vision, some different strategies with goals and objectives. They summarize most of their data in one place. Okay, and so they're trying to provide a snapshot in terms of what the community is trying to achieve in terms of housing. The other thing that they did is they have this online interactive story map. Okay, so you can turn on and off various layers. The one shown here happens to be environmental corridors and environmentally sensitive areas. So these are like the areas that are off limits to future development. And then there's kind of an accounting of what is included here. So surface water, steep slopes, wetlands, and so forth. So you can turn on and off additional layers, much like many interactive GIS maps that you see at the county level. Okay. So as we step back and think about how do we develop that future land use map, it's really a process, okay? It's a process of thinking about some of these base maps that are required as part of the planning process. Natural resources, agricultural resources, maybe where are utilities available, where can they be extended, things of that nature. And it's about looking at them holistically and then moving to that future land use map in terms of where is future development appropriate, what types of uses, what density of development, and so forth. So if we want to see this in terms of text, we're really looking at those existing conditions. Again, what kind of existing land uses or land cover do we have? What's our underlying soil or topography, et cetera? And then we're thinking of it through a policy lens. Do we have the capacity to expand? Are there physical limitations? Perhaps is ownership playing a factor here? What are regulatory and policy constraints and so forth? Okay, and so we're using all these things to develop the future land use map. Okay, this is a guiding document. It's not the same as zoning. It's not regulatory, but it should be consulted when you're making those types of zoning and other land use decisions. So I want to pause here, Lynn. I'm wondering if there have been any questions placed in the chat box so far. And if not, I will remind everyone that this would be a great time to include some questions if you have them.
Sure, we're not seeing any questions at this point, Becky.
Perfect. We'll have about 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. Before we get there, I just want to quickly run through some different data and mapping resources. So oftentimes we have a lot of communities that are, I would say, kind of mid-sized cities and smaller, a lot of villages, a lot of towns, and a lot of counties that tend to join us. So one of the places I would recommend that you look is how do you capitalize on existing resources? And what's available to most communities in the state would be the support of regional planning commissions. Part of their mission is to be looking at data and resources and providing mapping data, okay? So see what is available if they prepared a regional comprehensive plan, if they are willing to provide assistance in the form of consultant services, or in some cases, different regional planning commissions have different capacity and they have different policies in terms of how they relate to their local communities. So this happens to be an example from the Southeast Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, and they talk about how some of their regional planning materials and maps are available at no cost. But then if you have very specific data requests, or if you want a base map that's tailored to your community, that can be done through a consulting service. The other thing I would suggest taking a peek at here, if you're looking for these types of resources, they do also have some sample public participation, hearing notice, resolution, and ordinance documents that you can utilize in updating or adopting a local plan. So that's just a nice little resource that happens to be available on this website. The other place I would highly recommend reaching out to is your county. Okay? You don't have to be a town to reach out to your county. This oftentimes works well for smaller cities and villages as well. But the vast majority, 71 in fact, out of 72 counties, maintain a web mapping site. And then the majority of counties have some sort of planning or zoning staff. So see how you can plug in and access and utilize their resources. In terms of looking here specifically in Wisconsin for additional data mapping resources, another place I recommend starting is with the Department of Administration, specifically the Demographic Services Center. Annually, they do population and housing unit estimates. And fairly recently, within the last year, they updated population projections. So based on the decennial census. So some of the data that you'll find if you were to dive into this, this happens to be a statewide snapshot. But one thing I want to point out is that even though Wisconsin's total population is projected to remain relatively stable over the next 10, 20, 30 years, that growth and in some cases decline throughout the state is not evenly distributed. So take a peek at the specific county and municipal projections. I would say over a third of counties and over half of municipalities, meaning towns, cities, and villages, are projected to have a declining population. Okay, so that is something to be aware of, and that you can pull up. You can either look for the term municipal or MCD data. That's how you're going to locate that on the DOA website. Also, another intriguing fact is kind of the age cliff that we're facing in this state. Certain parts of the state happen to be experiencing pretty drastic changes in terms of age structure within their communities. So there's some communities you can see highlighted here, such as Adams County, Door County, and almost the entire northern tier of our state, where we're not only seeing population decline in some of these areas, but we're also seeing age rates really increase. In part, some of this is reflected in seasonal and recreational use, as well as retirement. But these are really important factors to be thinking about from a planning perspective. And then in terms of data, those projections from DOA were only made possible because we have somewhat recently released decennial census data, which means that's data that's collected once every 10 years. So if you want to take a peek at this for your community, I suggest pulling up the profiles. The most recent data tool is called data.census.gov. Okay? And if you tap on that profile at the end, you can start to type in your community name. Be aware, however, here I've typed in Ashland, and we know that there's an Ashland County, you know, there's an Ashland City, and there's an Ashland Town. So be specific. If you're looking for town data, type that in here. Okay. The other place you can drill down if you want additional detailed data is through these filters. And again, what you're looking for is a town or a municipality would actually be considered a county subdivision. So look for that terminology. And these are the types of profiles that pop up. If you were to continue scrolling down this page, there's actually nice little graphics that go along with all of this. All right, I want to spend just the last couple of moments reflecting on funding for planning, as well as plan implementation. Okay, when the comprehensive planning law was first adopted in the state, there were grants that helped subsidize planning efforts within communities. Those don't exist anymore. They haven't existed since 2010. And as far as I'm aware, there's no plans to resurrect that in the near future. Okay. But there are still grant opportunities out there. In some cases, there's funding specifically for comprehensive planning, but in other situations, there's funding that becomes available if you have updated plans. Okay, so many grant opportunities actually require updated plans to be eligible, and they include bonus points when you plan or prioritize projects. The other thing you can think of, plans tend to be pretty heavy on data and maps, and those pieces of information can be used to justify your project or help determine eligibility for various grants. Okay, so I recommend, not every community really has the capacity to write grants. So where possible, partnering with your county, regional planning commission, or consultants to both update your plans as well as to seek out potential grant opportunities. I'm going to run through super quick just a few opportunities that are at the top of my mind. Okay, this one happens to be a natural resource and parks related one. It's a Knowles Nelson Stewardship Grant. And I just want to show you some of the required and bonus points that can come into play here. So if you have a comprehensive plan that supports intergovernmental cooperation, you're awarded bonus points. And if the proposed project is described in a plan or supported by it, you also get bonus points. Likewise, additional planning documents, such as a river or lake management plan or other plans, can give you bonus points. So in many grants, they're based strictly on who scores the highest. And so if you can show that you have some of these supporting documents in place, you're going to be set up to score in a higher manner and hopefully be more successful with these grants. Community development block grants, these are actually federal pass-through funds that comes through the state of Wisconsin. This particular one happens to be focused on low and moderate income. Okay, so you're going to want to take a peek to see which communities qualify based on glance and data. But what I really want to show here is that this program is really underutilized. in 2025, there are only 2 communities that applied for and were awarded these grants. There's been some years like 2023 where nobody applied for these grants. So if you have a higher proportion of low or moderate income folks within your community, or for a given area within your community, think about how you can utilize these resources. And then lastly, there's some additional programs through WIDA, some loan programs, such as infrastructure access loans that require updated housing elements to be eligible for these types of loans. So with that, I think we'll turn Lynn. Are we getting any additional questions in the chat box? If not, I see you're busy posting some of those resources as well.
Right. We don't have additional questions right now, Becky. I would say another option is if people can unmute themselves, they could ask a question that way as well.
Thank you. The other thing that I will remind folks of as we're waiting to see if there's any additional questions is that these webinars will be recorded. Morgan is processing all of those videos. A couple of them have been posted already to our webinars page. And once all 5 videos are available, we'll send out another email reminder directing people directly to those links. So I would encourage you, if there's others within your community, perhaps other members of your plan commission, et cetera, who might benefit from these videos, do feel free to share them and use this as a opportunity to initiate local conversations in terms of planning, what updates might be necessary, or what additional implementation tools you might need to be thinking about updating. All right, well, I'm not seeing questions pouring in. So I do want to let you know my email is listed here. If you think of questions after this webinar, you are more than welcome to reach out. Email is the best way to reach me. And I encourage your questions, whether it's kind of one of the technicalities of how does comprehensive planning work, or if you're looking some additional resources or support, let me know. And I'm happy to help you as we are able. So I want to thank you again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.